Did you know a barrel of maple syrup is worth more than a barrel of crude oil? A cunning crew of sticky bandits in Canada certainly did. My name is Nick. This is Crime Dog. Roll the intro. If you are accustomed to this channel, you know I love a good heist, and this one is up there with the best. It was a crime that rocked the nation and shattered records as the most expensive heist in Canadian history. If you were thinking of the usual treasures like precious jewels or cash, you would be wrong. These crooks made off with an unprecedented $18.7 million worth of liquid gold. Pure, unadulterated Canadian maple syrup. They meticulously planned their heist, striking at the heart of the Quebec Federation of Maple Syrup Producers, often referred to as the OPEC of maple syrup. As I said in the intro, pure maple syrup is far more valuable than crude oil. They made off with a stunning 12.5% of their prized syrup reserves. The shortage that followed
was a disaster.
Pancakes all over Canada were left dry, and Tim Hortons were unable to sell their beloved maple dip donuts.
No, God!
Some even viewed the sticky bandits as heroes. The Federation controlled the marketing and production of all maple syrup in Quebec, regulating its supply and maintaining a massive reserve, worth up to $185 million in a secure warehouse on the outskirts of Quebec City. This ensures that the market is never flooded and prevents suppliers from going bankrupt. The Federation has received criticism in the past, with some calling it a cartel, a communist regime, or even a mafia. Those who are critical of the Federation argue that they struggle to make ends meet under their rule. The thieves responsible for the heist were daring, managing to steal 9,571 barrels from one of the Federation's fortified warehouses outside of Montreal. That's nearly 3,000 tons, with each barrel worth a hefty 2,000 Canadian dollars. So how did they pull it off, you may ask? Knowing that the barrels in the strategic reserve were only inspected once a year, the cunning plan consisted of swapping out the syrup barrels with almost identical replicas, right down to the exact shade of paint and make. They also stuck official-looking stickers on the barrels, mirroring those used by the Federation. Cheeky. They used trucks to transport the barrels to a remote sugar shack. What is a sugar shack, you may ask? It's actually a cabin where the sap from the sugar maple trees is collected, and there it's boiled into maple syrup. Learn something new every day. I had no idea. Where they siphoned off the syrup, refilled the barrels with water, then returned them to the facility. At first glance, everything would seem perfectly normal. But the thieves didn't stop there. As the operation progressed, swapping out the barrels became too time-consuming. So they began directly siphoning off the barrels in the reserve without refilling them. So what was left was fake barrels filled with water and original barrels that were completely empty. From there, the syrup was transported via tractor trailers to the south and to the east, where it was trafficked in small batches to reduce suspicion. It was typically sold to legitimate syrup distributors who were unaware that it was stolen, but also to black market exporters. The syrup was meant to be safely guarded in Quebec, but it was being sold all over the world. However, the ruse was finally uncovered when the barrels started to rust. You see, maple syrup doesn't cause metal to rust, but water does. In July 2012, the Federation began its annual inventory. The inspectors noticed the rust and realised that some of the barrels were actually empty. One inspector, Michel Gouvreau, almost met an untimely death when he climbed up them, expecting the 600-pound barrels to easily take his weight. As they were empty, they almost collapsed underneath him and he almost fell to his death. Now aware that they'd been robbed, the Federation immediately notified authorities. This led to an extensive and thorough investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies and a team of skilled detectives. Finding stolen maple syrup is no easy feat, especially when compared to recovering jewels, cash, or gold. With syrup meant for consumption, most of it had already been devoured. Police raids were conducted in New Brunswick, Ontario, and south of the border in New Hampshire and Vermont. Over 200 witness interviews were conducted and 26 arrests were made. 40 search warrants were then executed, resulting in the recovery of some of the syrup. However, a considerable amount had already been sold and consumed. It's rare in a case that the evidence ends up being eaten. Despite the challenges, the police were determined to solve the case. The thieves had made mistakes and left behind incriminating evidence. Fingerprints were found on some of the barrels, and the floor was littered with dirty boot prints. The barrels themselves were covered in scratches left by the rough handling of the stolen syrup. The Federation typically uses special forklifts to transport their barrels, leaving no scratches or marks behind. The thieves, however, took shortcuts and rented regular forklifts, causing scratches and dents on the barrels. The forensic team was able to match the scratches with the type of forklift used, ultimately leading them to the location where they were rented. One of the thieves even used his real name when renting the forklift. This, as you can imagine, would prove to be a critical error. Many of the key players in this heist were anti-Federation syrup producers, while others may have been embroiled in the crime without even realizing it. One such individual was Richard Valliere, who told police he'd been buying and selling syrup on the black market for the last 10 years, and he'd previously had run-ins with the Federation. The trial heard that over $200,000 in cash was handed over for a single syrup transaction, and the crooks used burner phones to avoid detection. During the trial, Valliere's lawyer stated that he was forced to buy the syrup and dilute it under the orders of a gun-wielding individual. The jury didn't believe his story and found him guilty of fraud, trafficking stolen goods, and theft. In April 2007, Valliere was sentenced to 8 years behind bars and ordered to pay a massive $9.5 million fine. The stakes were high, as failing to pay the fine could result in an additional 14 years in prison. However, the Quebec Court of Appeal showed mercy and reduced the fine to just $1 million. Things changed, however, in March of 2022 in a unanimous decision. The Supreme Court in Canada said that Valliere must pay the fine equal to the value of the stolen syrup, not just equal to the profits that he made from it. The Supreme Court said that the Quebec Court of Appeal was wrong to reduce his fine to just $1 million. Valliere now has 10 years to pay the fine. If not, he will spend an extra 6 years in prison. In contrast, a guy named PIERRE, the exporter who sold the syrup on to other countries, presents a more sympathetic figure in this saga. Despite being sentenced to serve 2 years minus 1 day in the community and 3 years on probation, many people have come to his defense. Pierre claims that his conviction was merely a result of the Federation trying to shut down his business and gain complete control of the maple syrup market in Canada. AVIK CANON, another one of the ringleaders, was handed a hefty punishment for his crimes. His wife was the manager of the warehouse, and that's how they got in the first place. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and given a $1.2 million fine. Prosecutors argued that when Canon laid his eyes on the sea of syrup in the warehouse, he knew he had struck gold. He was apparently the driving force behind the heist. We hear that as the operation unfolded, nerves started to fray, people started to have doubts. But Canon reportedly had ties to the Italian mafia and threatened anyone who dared to speak out against the operation. When he was sentenced to jail, Canon was livid. He launched into a tirade, cursing at the judge and even getting into a physical altercation with one of the guards. Meanwhile, Sebastien JUTRAS, a truck driver who was involved in transporting the syrup, he served 8 months in prison. He was the one who introduced Canon to Richard Valliere. Throughout, Jutras maintained that he had no idea that he was transporting stolen syrup. Likely story, my friend. The maple industry has been plagued by tension and conflict for decades, with the Federation of Quebec maple syrup producers on one side and smaller farmers and sellers on the other. The smaller players have had ongoing disputes with the Federation's inspectors, with some of them accusing them of using intimidation tactics to run them out of business. In the early 2000s, 3 regional offices had their sugar shacks burnt down. It's worth mentioning that the Federation holds a near monopoly on the whole industry, with the majority of the real maple syrup sold worldwide produced by the organization. The maple syrup industry generates annual sales of over $400 million, with Quebec accounting for a whopping 75% of the global maple syrup supply. If, like me, you enjoy a good heist, check out this next video about Albert ST.PIERRE, chief orchestrator of the heist of the century, which took place in Nice in the 1970s. Comment below and tell me what you think about these cheeky chaps. We cover a lot of dark and gruesome crimes on this channel, but sometimes it's nice to discuss something slightly more light-hearted, where nobody dies. Not that I am condoning their actions, of course. I hope you enjoyed this story. We release new videos every week.
Yes! That's awesome!
And I look forward to seeing you very soon. Until next time, stay safe and look after yourselves.